Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. Thanks so very much for joining us. We are fortunate this evening to have a awesome lineup for you today. My name is Lisa Neal-Graves, and I am running for Douglas County Commissioner for District 2. And I am blessed to have with me Darien Wilson. Darien.
Hi, I'm Darien Wilson. I'm running for Douglas County Commissioner District 3, and we're so excited to be joined by Colorado's Attorney General Phil Weiser tonight. Phil?
It's great to be with both of you. I am huge fans of you both. You are the dynamic duo for Douglas County. And what everyone needs to understand is in an era where people are craving creative problem solvers who are weary of political games and division, you two are the antidote for what ails our politics. And we need to start that work here in Douglas County.
Thanks, Phil. We're so delighted to have you with us tonight. And as some of you who have actually joined us for the last meeting with Tony Spurlock, he was planning to be here tonight, but will not be able to make it. But he did send some comments by Darien. So we'll talk about that when they come up. But today, what we want to do is focus really on some questions around school safety and the criminal justice reform. And then if we have some time, we also want to weave in a little bit on public health. So Phil, thanks you so much for joining us. We know that you're incredibly busy, and we just want to make sure that we maximize your time. I guess we'll start with a little bit of criminal justice reform a bit, and really it's about post. And this is one of those questions that we were hoping that both you and Tony would be able to read into. But you know, Douglas County has roughly about 1.4% Black population. And because it's such a limited population, it is assumed, and we've sort of, the silence has been deafening with regard to any of the elected officials speaking to what has happened both with, George Floyd, with Arbor, all of those things that have happened in our nation that's galvanized folks to really protest. And so the question that we have is, what are you doing in post to support counties like ours and other similarly situated counties to really help them understand what they need to do around these racist roots in law enforcement? You know, what are the things that we should be looking for coming up? We know that there's new legislation, but what is POST doing specifically?
I want to mention 2 points that are priority efforts. And first, for those who are unfamiliar with POST, it stands for the Peace Officer Standards and Training Program. So we have a oversight board. I'm the chair, Tony's the vice chair. And the goal is to elevate law enforcement so that it's worthy of our trust. And this effort goes back to Ken Salazar. John Suthers doubled down on it. It is a opportunity that we have to elevate law enforcement and address issues such as racism, bias. And so 2 particular, maybe 3 points are worth mentioning. Number 1, working with the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, we are working on training around hate crimes, which is something we are seeing on the rise. It's on the rise against people based on sexual orientation and gender identity, based on race, based on religion. And what's important is that we train our police officers so that they're able to understand when it's happening, report it, and prosecute it as such. So that's the first one. The second is it's very important that we manage witness identifications in a fair and appropriate manner. And we've heard the horror stories. Literally, it might be as much as it was a Black man who did this, or worse yet, a Black man in a gray hoodie. And then you get another Black man not in a gray hoodie, as if that's the same thing. And this is sometimes problematic through a process called show-ups, which is witness ID in a suggestive, unfair way. So we're working actually with Denver and Grand Junction on training related to how to do witness ID in an appropriate, non-biased way. And then also we're working on training related to implicit bias and de-escalation. And you'll see this when you look into some of the reporting about how some jurisdictions have done a good job avoiding officer-involved shootings. They have training in de-escalation like Durango. So that's the post-training agenda. to meet the challenges of this moment. And we are looking forward and working towards, with hopefully some renewed support from legislative authority, even more empowering posts, because our work is more important than ever. And I'll tell you, thank you, Douglas County, for sharing some of Tony's time. He's so well respected, so thoughtful. We need his leadership, not just on the extreme risk protection order, I know we're going to talk about that, but also on post as well.
Yeah, and I think along those same lines, and then Darien, I'll yield to you to actually ask another question that's really related to this on the school safety side. But there's one other question I'd really like to understand around what you're doing in the peace officers standards. You know, the fact that we're talking about standards specifically. What are the metrics that you guys are, and can you even dictate what the standard metrics are that you should be capturing when a police does either a stop and it's just a regular traffic stop, or an arrest if they're called to arrest someone?
So we don't have that generic authority. The legislature, and this gets to Mary's question now too, the legislature is in the process of looking at some reforms of police oversight and accountability. And I think they're looking at that issue, Lisa, that you just talked about. What we can do, and we'll keep trying to do, is support and encourage local jurisdictions to raise their practice, to elevate their practice. One of the delicate points here, and the legislature is struggling with this right now, is how much of this do you ask for reporting based on race? And do you see that potentially having unintended consequences? I think we just got to be thoughtful about this. The fact is, if you don't measure things, it's hard to manage them. And so it is important to measure it. And it's important to look closely, particularly once you get officer-involved shootings, which is the most extreme area. And I would just commend to everybody, Allison Sherry did some fabulous reporting of officer-involved shootings in the state.
Nice. Darien?
Thanks, Lisa. I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping before I get started. I neglected to mention earlier something I wanted to be sure and say, which is that Lisa and I have a couple of events this week that we're really excited about in addition to this one. Wednesday, we're going to start our June food drive. Our May food drive was really successful. We were able to donate almost 1,500 pounds of food and toiletries to the Health and Hope Center in Castle Rock. And we're going to do it again this month. And we're hoping to get 2,500, enough to feed, how many was it? 25 families for a week.
A week.
Yeah. So that's our goal. And we would really appreciate, we're going to be collecting food from the 12th to the 16th. And then we'll be delivering it to the Help and Hope Center on the 17th. And there will be links to that in the chat. And also this Saturday morning, Jason Crow will be doing a coffee with Lisa and me at 9:30 in the morning. We're going to start at 9:30. Jason's going to join in at 10:30. And we would love for you to join that as well. And the link to that will be in the chat as well. I also wanted to say, in case anybody missed it or doesn't see the chat, that you can ask questions in the chat. So now that we're caught up on all the housekeeping, I did have a question. Tay Anderson is a young adult who is elected to the school board in Denver. He's a young Black man, and he's been very vocal in the protests in Denver in the last weeks. And one of the things that he's been pushing for, and he's been successful, is removing SROs from the schools in Denver. And he was able to get the school board in Denver to vote to support that. And so Lisa and I were wondering what it would mean if the SROs were removed from Douglas County schools.
It's a really important question, and it's worth struggling with this, as I know you will, thoughtfully. When we had the shooting at the STEM high school, one of the concerns was the SRO there, I believe, was not a member of the Douglas County Sheriff. It was a private person who, by at least the accounts I saw, did not handle himself in a way that was actually, let's say, elevating school safety in the way we might like. And so part of our challenges, and one of them, I had a great conversation with Bishop Foreman last week, and he made some point that was really important. We have to be able to hold two truths at the same time. One truth is we need to protect our children, and responsible SROs can actually save lives in that moment. That's true. We need to protect our schools. What's also true is in too many cases, and this is what Tay's responding to in Denver, and Omar Montgomery has led this issue in Aurora, we've seen SROs turned into disciplinary officers giving out criminal citations where previously we didn't have that form of escalation. And there's a name for that. It's called the school to prison pipeline. We're going to be working hard on that issue in our office. Lisa, when she was with us, had been working on that issue. We're actually going to announce some partnerships soon about this. It's bothersome. And when you look at different schools based on race, it confronts you. So for example, during the campaign, I had conversations and Lisa was part of them. And I heard about what's happening in Aurora and all the rising criminal citations. Now, thanks to Omar's work, they've cut those in half. But when I went to the St. Vrain School District in Boulder, which is mostly white, the word there is, oh no, we don't want our SROs ever giving criminal citations because you give people a record and we escalate situations when we could use restorative justice. So my view is the first best solution, if you can achieve it, is responsible SROs who don't escalate situations, don't get themselves turned into giving out criminal citations, but are there to protect students from harm. If the SROs, for whatever reason, can't function in that way, and they hijack the disciplinary function and fuel the school to prison pipeline, then I get the frustration that you saw Tay acting on.
And we have, it's a concern here in DCSD with developmentally disabled students as well. And the reason that I brought it up is that Tay has challenged all the schools in Colorado to follow. Also that in Denver, there are some schools that have an SRO, but no counselor or nurse. Thankfully, we passed our bond MLO in 2018 in DCSD, and now we have a counselor at every school, in addition to SROs at some of the schools. But I just wanted to clarify some of those points.
Yeah, let me say, my answer to Tay is, Tay, every school district has to do what's right for them. And my challenge is different than Tay's. My challenge is make sure that if you have SROs, they're acting on behalf of school safety and not fueling a school to prison pipeline. And as I mentioned, the St. Vrain School District doesn't have a problem with that because they're very clear in chartering what SROs are supposed to do. But if you find yourself in the thick of this, I get the frustration, I get the action. Now, Tay raised the second point, which is, I think, analytically distinct, and you just made a distinction. If you're forced to make budget choices, what should you prioritize? And I will tell you, as the Attorney General, I don't weigh into that issue. I get this all the time. Shouldn't every school have a metal detector, for example, is one of the questions I get. And I say, every school should be open 5 days a week, in my view, but half of the Colorado school districts have 4-day-a-week schools. So I'm not about to tell counties and local governments how to make these terrible trade-offs. I want to help elevate and support you all, but I'm not here to tell you what to do.
And
Makes
so
sense.
Phil, just to go along those same lines, Darien, having met with the folks at St. Vrain, one of the things that I recognized and they shared was that they were collecting data that helped them to understand the differences between both the sexes of the students. So whether a student was a male or female or cisgendered or fluid gendered, but they also collected data about race. And it was the combination of those things that really helped them to understand and set policy effectively. And it focused them away from, sort of the management of discipline with students more towards, sort of the aggregate and things that they needed to do to protect all students in a safe way, right? So putting in place, policies around what would happen if a student did something that was a behavioral problem. That was, many times when I was in school anyway, it was the gym teacher that you actually sent the student to. And generally those gym teachers have a different relationship with students and can help them understand what was going on. What they found was that there were specific, they partnered. So the SROs partnered with teachers and counselors. And to your point, Darien, the fact that we now have counselors in every school, I don't know if we have enough counselors, but we have counselors in every school. That's at least helpful. And I think that's on the right track.
Let me make a plug. I'm
No,
sorry.
please. No, please go.
My plug was going to be for a program we offer, and we work, I know, closely with the Douglas County Schools on. It is called Safe to Tell.
Right.
And the school counselors are our core partners. And so if a school doesn't have a counselor, it's hard to have a school safety program, because a lot of the school safety issues now are things like bullying or students who are threatening to take their own lives, for example. And we need the infrastructure in our schools to protect safe schools. And I think what Tay's getting at is safe schools is a broader concept that is not limited to SROs. And you can have an SRO ending up getting redirected to other things. And the model, Lisa, you touched on it really beautifully, and I'm not surprised given your background. You need your SRO, you need your counselor, and you need your gym teachers all working together. Sometimes it's part of a safe school committee to create an environment that is broad and inclusive. And this is the challenge we have with law enforcement. And again, Tony's wisdom here is valuable. If law enforcement thinks all they have is a hammer, everything's a nail. But if you instead, and I had this great experience with a correctional officer when I got a tour of the Sterling prison. She said she was a nurse before she became a corrections officer. She said she has her taser and she has her voice. She knows how to use her voice before her taser. And that's a teaching that all law enforcement needs, SROs particularly. One exciting program we've seen in some areas, I don't know if it's in Douglas County yet, but it gets to Darien's point about developmental disabilities, is we need behavioral health professionals who are able to work with counselors and SROs and police, so that we're not being too quick to use the criminal justice system where there are other systems that are better to address the issue.
Well, we were going to ask you about Safe to Tell, so I'm glad you brought it up. How's it working during COVID?
This is a really important point, Darien, and thank you for the chance to talk more about it. Everyone needs to know that Safe to Tell is a 365-day-a-year program. It's 7 days a week. You need to know that when your kids are hurting, when your kids are facing threats, whether someone dealing drugs, someone engaged in bullying, cyberbullying right now is actually on the rise. Safe to Tell is a trusted platform. It's going to remain anonymous. One of the highlights I had was when someone said to me, they have a high schooler who was saying their kid was dealing drugs, and the mom was like, I'm just going to call the principal to tell him. The mom finally did. The principal said, oh, I've already gotten 9 Safe to Tell tips already. That warms my heart, because a lot of times people are afraid if their kid or them are going to be the one, but they need to tell the principals, the school counselors, and in some cases law enforcement, because what breaks my heart is the story when we do hear, we show up at someone's home with a threat of a concern around suicide, and the individual has already committed suicide. That's what is heartbreaking. This program can save lives if we get the information in the right hands in the right time. And this program came out of Columbine, not too far from where you guys are. It turns out that the threats are much broader than just someone going to a school like happened at the STEM high school. There's all sorts of other threats, and we've broadened the program to deal with them. We've also broadened the program to talk about mental health issues, because the number one threat to our young people, 12 to 24-year-olds, is suicide.
Yeah. Should we talk a little bit then about that? Because I do think, one of the key issues that our kids face with COVID is they don't really get to hang out, right? And one of the things that we know from a growth and development perspective is that that's part of the socialization process. And when they don't have the opportunity to go out and hang out with their friends, there is a level of depression, there is a level of probably suicidal thoughts that happen. Are you the numbers, like if you think about the numbers at Safe to Tell post, I should say prior to COVID, and now the numbers now that we are in the midst of COVID, sort of hopefully lending or tending towards the end, we don't know yet. But are you seeing numbers that are very different from before versus now?
Lisa, it's hard to untangle this, because during times when school is out, we get less Safe to Tell reports.
Gotcha.
So I don't know that I could say that our Safe to Tell statistics are a good baseline. around mental health. Part of what I want to say here, and boy, you and Darren are so wonderful leaders, we need to destigmatize this conversation.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to be able to acknowledge that people confront mental illness, anxiety, depression. That's normal. And I remember, and maybe you both too, this great movie called Terms of Endearment around 1980, where it captured back then, 1980, cancer was stigmatized. If you had cancer, you didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
Today, people are like, cancer sucks. They'll talk about it. It's not something that people are ashamed of anymore. We need to get there about mental health.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. And one of the things I want to do is make it easier for families to access mental health resources before they're in crisis. That's a problem that a lot of families have, is that once they're in crisis, they reach out for mental health resources, and it's a month or two until they can see someone, and they're like, they end up in the emergency room, or they end up with, you know, a team at their house with an officer and a mental health person. And backing up from that, how can we nip that in the bud so you don't get to that point where you're riding in an ambulance, where instead you can get an appointment when you need one. So it's just tough for families to connect to mental health resources a lot of times, and that's something we need to address as well.
So let's take a couple of questions from the actual chat. So
Yeah.
there's a question here that really, it's talking about sort of the role of the county commissioner and the interaction with you specifically, Phil. I guess the question that I would have around this is, we know that you have a relationship with Tony Spurlock, and that's because he is actually the vice chair of Post. And so it just worked out that you were working on a common, organizational function. Are there other counties that you have interaction with as the AG on things like, for example, public safety, policing, and community, right? Is your relationship with Tony normal, I guess, is the real question.
Yeah, so I will say Tony's exemplary, and it's a pleasure to work with him. And the two individuals you're running against are at the other end of the spectrum.
Right.
And so I will say the third county commissioner, who neither of you are running against, is Abe Layton.
Right.
We graduated from CU Law School. Abe and I know each other and have a good relationship and can talk about issues, just like Tony and I can. I've got relationships with a lot of Republican county commissioners across the state. You two are running against two individuals. In Darren's case, an incumbent. In your case, it's going to be someone else who are, let's just say, not necessarily committed to reality as a constraint. By which I mean, if you're not living in the real world, but in an imagined world of political games, it's hard to work together. Tony is someone who's living in the real world. And I have to talk about the Extreme Risk Protection Order a little bit because it's the most obvious example, but we can talk about COVID and other issues. The facts are the Extreme Risk Protection Order will save lives. Now, Tony knew that from a very deeply personal experience, which is why Zach Parrish is who the law is named after. And Tony wasn't afraid to stand up for reality. And when I talked all across the state about the Extreme Risk Protection Order, I said, look at other states who've had this law, map it onto Colorado. We're going to have about 120 of these a year in Colorado. And we're on track for that right now. Second thing I said is every court who's heard challenges based on the constitutionality of this law have said this law is constitutional. We've had two challenges in Colorado. Our offices has been involved in both. Both have said clearly this law is constitutional. That's living in the real world. Now, unfortunately, to the two individuals who seats are available, we're not living in the real world. They adopted this Second Amendment sanctuary county, which is a fictional world. It's fictional because the Second Amendment does not protect dangerous people to have a firearm. That was made clear by Justice Scalia in the Heller opinion. And also, it's because they're undermining a sheriff who's committed to public safety and using this tool. And anyone who is committed to being responsible, I want to work with. And I'll tell you, the El Paso County Sheriff said, I don't like the law. I'll challenge it in court. But if it's the law of Colorado, it's my job to follow it. I can work with the El Paso County Sheriff. I can have conversations with people who I disagree with. But the problem that Douglas County has in the 2 seats you guys are looking at is we have people who are looking at the world through what you might call magical thinking or political games. And frankly, that's a danger to our democratic republic. That is a danger to Colorado. You're both incredibly smart, accomplished, caring, creative individuals. If we can't get Douglas County to elect the 2 of you against the 2 people we run against, it's because people aren't paying attention. That's the only reason I can come up with.
Well, and that's interesting, Phil. One of the things that I know from your campaign that you had to spend a lot of time educating people on the role of the Attorney General. And that was really, for all intents and purposes, people kind of understood that there was an Attorney General, but they still had a really hard time figuring out what an Attorney General does. Darien and I are in a similar kind of space, and I think it's even more deficit in that area because for all intents and purposes, if you look at the responsibilities that the county commissioner has, and you think about the trust that should be, sort of placed in the arms and the minds and the hearts of those county commissioners to operate in the best interest of all of the residents of Douglas County, what we find is that is not quite the case in our case anyway. What we are finding is that decisions are being made in really interesting ways. That was one of the reasons why we did the food drive, is that our county commissioners gave $50,000 to 5 food banks, and they gave $13.3 million to public safety for schools, none of which they've articulated or been able to help people understand what the ROI is. One of the things that you've had to do in your office is to put into layman's terms and information that is for public consumption, decisions that you're making based on even things like that, right? We're not seeing there's no infographics on how many schools have implemented programs, what the results of those programs are. What is it that we can do as candidates really to help close the gap in helping people sort of understand and care about? Because it's not just understanding, it is really, I need to care about it. And when you're in a county that is, for all intents and purposes, pretty wealthy, those are things that haven't really impacted them directly, but they are impacting them. How do we make sure that we're talking about it without being sort of Chicken Little?
Well, a couple things. First off, everyone on this call, everyone who watches this, I want you to start with the following point. Do consumers get good services from a monopoly? Because this race is about whether or not you believe in competition or a monopoly. Because if people vote for your opponents, I believe they're voting because they believe they don't have a choice, and they believe that Republicans have to have a monopoly on this commission, no matter who the Republican candidates are, no matter who the Democratic candidates are. So if you believe that competition's good, and you believe people get better results with competition, you need to take a look at this race and not vote in a way that you're a captive customer, because no one in Douglas County is captive. They need to take a hard look at the choice they have. Number 2, you use the initials, ROI, which means return on investment. I talked before about data. Are you living in the world of data, the world of reality, or are you living in the world of political talking points and games?
Right.
And you can't be bothered to actually engage in the data. So COVID's a good example. There are people out there who want to say COVID is a fiction. We shouldn't take any precautions ever. That is a very dangerous game. I don't know what you would say to the over 100,000 lives who were lost. Is that fiction? Is that made up? I personally find that an offensive statement. I will tell you, Tony Spurlock finds that an offensive statement. He has been very responsible from both a rule of law perspective, from a compassionate perspective, from a collaboration perspective. And we need those people. And a lot of Republicans are compassionate, are realistic, are concerned about our future. They need to realize those qualities are more important than the label of the candidate. And that's how you get there. You say, what are your values? Start with the values. Are your values fiscal responsibility? Are your values We want to live in a community where we're here helping each other. If those are your values, then ask what candidates meet your values. Don't act like a captive customer who has no choices.
I like it. Yeah. There is another question that just came in on the chat, and that is several of the folks that are on the line had an encounter with some white supremacists in Colorado Springs last night. Can we talk about what can be done at the county and state level to combat these groups? And is there a special task force working on this? And can we report issues and find data on recent activities? Right, there was an article, can't remember the gentleman who wrote the article, but it was in like one of those Breitbart magazines or newspapers, and he was saying that he wanted the Klansmen to ride again. I wonder if this was in response to that.
I've talked a lot about this. Part of the world we're now in with social media is if you're a white supremacist, you can find other white supremacists and be empowered in ways you weren't before. So white supremacy is on the rise. Hate crimes are on the rise. Part of what we have to do is a couple different things. First off, make sure that we are reporting such behavior to the law enforcement. Make sure law enforcement is positioned to address it. Make sure that we have efforts like the Anti-Defamation League who are keeping an eye on white supremacist groups, like the one who was going to attack the synagogue in Pueblo, and acting proactively. The other thing that we can do, and this is where this moment in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, we have a real opportunity where people are willing to have conversations about race. And Lisa, I have to give you a real shout out here because I taught you constitutional law and we talked about the 14th Amendment. And afterwards, I said to you, I kind of chickened out about how I taught that, didn't I? And you're like, yeah, Phil, you did. And that was important because after that, I said, I need to make sure when I teach the 14th Amendment, I first start by teaching the Dred Scott decision, which says that if you were an African-American, you were property, you were not a person. And that was in our country, under our Constitution, by our Supreme Court. Now, that was overturned by the 14th Amendment, but part of the problem, which is now being grappled with in a more open way, is recognizing what our history is. And white supremacy was at the founding of our nation. There were people who were very pro-slavery from a philosophical standpoint and believed that that was part of our nation. And we did have a civil war, which was won. We got those Reconstruction amendments, but then we didn't end up getting a Reconstruction premised on racial equality. We got Jim Crow. And so what I would challenge all of us to be our best authentic selves, to ask questions, to learn, and to be committed to all fighting for racial equality. We can do that. I know you've talked about it in the campaign. I really appreciate your grandfather, your dad rather, being a pioneer, who was willing to be one of the first African-Americans hired by IBM. That was a big deal. For those who haven't seen the movie Hidden Figures, that's another big deal story about people who were given opportunity and did great things with it. We have to recognize before the 1960s, if you were an African-American, you probably didn't get opportunities in this country, period. Now, once that civil rights movement came, it didn't mean the doors of opportunity just opened wide. They started to creak open a little bit. It's our job to keep opening and to keep pushing for racial and gender equality because as Justice Ginsburg's life personified, if you're a woman, you did get opportunities. So that's what we're fighting for here, and that fight's not over.
Yeah. Phil, I appreciate that you said you did the talk and then you asked Lisa, did I get that right? And then you changed your behavior. And I think that that's key, is admitting when we make mistakes and saying, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Let's do better next time. I think that's really critical. And it's also important to try to be not just not racist, but anti-racist. And so one of the ways that folks can be anti-racist is support a Black woman running for office. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
We need more women. We need more women leaders. And I will tell Douglas County, you all have the opportunity to elect two of the best women leaders possible. this is an extraordinary opportunity to have the two of you as leaders on this commission. It would be a gift to our whole state, and I'm excited what you can do. And to Lisa's point here, we've never had a Black woman as a county commissioner in any county. Douglas County gets to show that they are not just not racist, but as you said, anti-racist, pro-women who get stuff done, right? And pro-creative problem solvers who aren't trapped by this whole political gamesmanship that is a toxin to our nation.
Right.
So one of the other questions I had for you was about the police reform bill. Someone in the chat asked about it. I'm not sure if the person in the chat was talking about the one in the US Congress or the one in the state Senate. I know there are two different bills, but when I talked to Tony today, Tony Spurlock, our sheriff, he said he apologized for missing this. He said he loves to do anything Phil does, and he apologizes he didn't try to not address us, but he was just too busy. But he supports the police reform bill. And did I hear correctly that it passed unanimously in the state Senate today?
Yeah, this is important. And I just want to underscore, there's a spirit of Colorado collaborative and creative problem solving that you and Lisa embody. The people you run against are the opposite, but they're political games players. And Tony, this is why, in a way, it's not about Democrats or Republicans. Yeah, Tony's a Republican, but he's a collaborative and creative problem solver. And he deserves people on this county commission of that party, because that's what's at stake in this election. This bill is working through in a collaborative, creative way. And you're right, today, and I'm just going to highlight two of the leaders, Bob Gardner, Colorado Springs Republican, John Cook, Weld County Republican, former sheriff, voted for the bill.
Wow.
And that's because the way this bill has been worked through is the right way, the way that you will both act as commissioners, the way Tony acts. And it's just a disabler when people are acting not based on facts, not creatively, not collaboratively. That's disabling. You are degrading the quality of your government. And that's what's happening in Douglas. That's why I find this race so compelling, because the choices are so stark. I don't want Douglas County's government degraded by picking people playing political games who are going to undermine Tony, not work with him.
Right.
And Tony has been working with the state legislature, as have I, on this bill, because we recognize we need more police accountability. We need to build trust in law enforcement. And you're right. In Colorado, we're doing it the right way. This bill will be a model for the nation. And then I'm going to have a lot of work with Tony to implement it and make sure we follow through on the trainings that Lisa was asking. So I am excited about the opportunity. I'm proud of Colorado's legislature. And just to shout out someone who I know Darien and I share affection for, proud of Jason Crow, who's working on the federal level, because there's also a parallel federal effort. But part of what we need during this time is leaders like Jason Crow, leaders like our state house, where you're seeing all these people come together, and leaders like you guys and Tony at the local level.
Thank you. Do you want to just briefly, before we move on, talk a little bit about what's in the bill? Or
yeah, let me give you a few of the high points. One point is, right now, it is lawful to shoot someone when they're running away from law enforcement. They're not a threat if they're so-called fleeing felon. And that was the justification that prevented any accountability in a number of cases we've had in Colorado, cases where DAs have brought matters to a grand jury. And the grand jury says, well, the person was a felon, they were fleeing, therefore the shooting was justified. And that's offensive, because if they're not a threat, why are you sanctioning their killing, which is what happened? And we got to fix that. Similarly with the allowance of chokeholds or no-knock warrants, again, overly escalating situations in ways that I believe are inappropriate. Also, this legislation, they're sort of working on the exact details, is going to help stand up a program where body cams and the requirement to keep them on is now the norm. And body cams are important because if you're an honest cop, body cams can get you off if you're accused of something. But if you're a bad cop, as we saw with the cops who killed George Floyd, game over. The fact that it's filmed, you may find yourself facing criminal charges. So those are a few of the highlights. There's some other specific work there for post. One of the things that I'm excited about is keeping a registry of police officers who are fired for their jobs for
Nice.
misconduct. So they can't just be rehired somewhere else, kind of a revolving door sort of way. And we're committed to following through on that. So that's a few of the high points of this bill. It also is going to allow for some more accountability for civil rights offenses, both my office having some authority and also some private actions as well. So that's a short version. It's also still a moving target, but what is meaningful is the way this legislation has been moving along reflects the engagement of people like Tony, like myself. It's a team effort. It's what Colorado does best. It's the sort of leadership and governance we need in Douglas County.
It's interesting, Phil. I know generally they can bring in the Attorney General to serve, to do the investigation for officers that are under, at least have some issue around arrest or you know, some behavioral issue. But the question that I have, there was an instance where you have a no-knock warrant, and then you also have the law of the state that basically says there's a make my day law in effect. So if somebody breaks in your house and you feel like you're at risk, you have the ability to shoot, or at least to protect you and your family. So you've got the make my day, but you also have this no knock. Is there some rationalization that has been done with this new legislation that at least says, are you doing away with no knock warrants? Tell me, how does that work?
Yes, ending no knock warrants.
Oh, they're ending it totally.
Unless, let me give you the exception. This is important for Tony. If the head of the department is going to authorize it personally, because they believe it's necessary to protect people, and this is important for the extreme risk protection order law. The case of Zach Parrish, when he died, that person who had all those weapons, they didn't want to knock for him.
Right.
They wanted to take the weapons away.
So if let's say, and let's not say it's Tony, let's just say there's an officer that says, yes, I will sign for that, and it turns out that they're wrong, do they still get qualified immunity?
Well, this law, you raised another topic we got to get to. First, only the head of the department can authorize a no-knock warrant under this law, as it currently stands.
Right, that's why I hated that it was Tony. But
so if the head of the department authorizes it, it would be allowed. This law is likely to change the qualified immunity defense. The qualified immunity doctrine is problematic for reasons that we probably don't have time to get into, and I might get a little too wonky on you if I try to explain why.
Right.
But I think there is a question about if a no-knock warrant is used in a responsible way because we have reason to believe it's necessary to save lives. Those are the exceptions. I think it's unlikely that the person executing it is going to be viewed as violating someone's civil rights. However, now that we've clearly made no-knock warrants, to use the German word verboten, if someone does it anyway, then you're right, they're going to be liable for violating someone's civil rights.
Wow.
And this is a larger conversation about the culture of policing. And one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that our police are building confidence and trust with the communities in which they serve. And that's a project that we at Post take very seriously.
So I just have one other question that's sort of an analog to that one, right? And that is that you have the scenario on the criminal side, but we also have this public health issue where our county commissioners have basically been out saying there's no need for masks, that they are seeking to have, they ultimately want to be able to get some, I can't even think of the word right now. Sorry about that. They're looking to have to be given literally a decision to say that you don't necessarily have to follow this portion of the Department of Health's ruling, that they're getting sort of a special dispensation to move forward with opening like gyms and swimming pools and a bunch of other things early. To the extent that citizens who are not necessarily participating in the actual activities, but are subject to other people who do? Is there any accountability that the county commissioners can be held to? Are they even, could they be considered negligent because they did this knowing that there was other counties that weren't doing this? And so I know that it's hard, negligence is always difficult, but I guess the issue that I have is there any recourse that a citizen has where the county commissioners have decided that more things should be open than is really warranted and or reasonable, like restaurants, instead of there being half of the population being there, they're saying we should have 3/4 of the population. In those situations, is there anything that the citizenry can have as a recourse if they're not participating, but they're still subject to people who were there and therefore they may get sick from those folks? Now we know that the disease itself is difficult to track, that it came from that restaurant, but the county opened up a lot faster than other counties. Can the county commissioners be held liable for that if the numbers actually shoot up?
Well, first and most importantly, there's a recourse. You vote those county commissioners out.
Well, you absolutely can vote them out.
Recourse, which is when you have an irresponsible, dangerous county commissioner endangering the public health and acting with a disregard for the rule of law, you vote them out. That's what has to happen. No Douglas County citizen is a captive customer of the existing county commissioners. They are a consumer who should make an informed choice. Second, the way the system works is really interesting. Let me explain it. The state level public health regime, to use the fancy word, is sort of governs the local level. So local county health authority doesn't have the ability to just break from what the state regime is. And I am so grateful, and I say this to him all the time, that Tony is your sheriff because he understands and cares for the rule of law on a deep level. So he's not willing to just disregard the rule of law. Now, those county commissioners you're talking about, they're from a different school of thought. Yeah. Their view is if they don't like the rule of law, they'll break it and they'll encourage others to break it. That's irresponsible and dangerous, and it can undermine their democratic republic. So when you have lawless county commissioners, what can you do about them? I think the best recourse is you vote them out. Now, here's the problem from a legal standpoint. In theory, none of their irresponsible lawless statements should ever take action because they will never be respected by the law. They're not authorized to do that. All they can do, and this is all they can do, they can ask their public health authority to petition the state for an exemption or a waiver.
Right.
But the state, thank goodness, is making those decisions based on data, based on responsible protection of the citizens. And that's how those decisions should be made.
Yeah. Darien?
I have a last question. So this kind of, it ends up tying in somewhat to systemic sexism. So businesses are opening back up. That's wonderful. We're happy our economy is starting back up again. Fantastic. I'm a small business owner. Things are getting better. They were bad for a while. Yay. However, school is still not in session. And, I'm working with a 9-year-old on my lap a lot of days. So I'm sympathetic. Some folks I know have, a 3-year-old and 6-month-old twins. So it's really hard to get work done when there's no daycare and there's no school. So what rights do employees have when their employer says, you need to come back to work and there's no school?
Well, let me first start by, and you started with an important point, which is what does it mean? We talked about systemic racism, systemic sexism. Here's what you need to know. And there's an important whole learning around implicit biases. I was committed to supporting my wife. So she worked through the entire time our kids were growing up. So did I. And I would take my kids for a couple days a week with me, just like you were talking about. And I would bring my kids to meetings. And as a guy, people would say, oh, isn't that cute? You've got the baby. But what a woman would be told is, oh, you must not take your job that seriously.
That's unprofessional, yeah.
That is sexism. And when women are said, oh, when you're being assertive, you know the nasty word, and you get called. And when men are assertive, they're like, oh, that's what we expect.
That's leadership.
That's right. That's sexism. So part of the challenge we all have is how do we set the right norms around diversity and inclusion in all workplaces so that these patterns don't continue. And what I want to see us do, and I'm working hard to do this in the AG's office, is recognize, and this whole COVID experience, a lot of times the flexible working is working. And so recognize that it's working. You've now put your finger on a unanswered legal question, which is if you are an employee and you're said, I need you to go in the office and your kids are at home, you have, I think, two questions. One is, will your office be safe from a public health standpoint? Would you be safer working at home? And I think from a legal rights standpoint, that might be a more promising legal right to say, which is, can your employer assure you that it's safe to go in as opposed to be at home? If the employer says, I can assure you it's safe, we take all those precautions, and we really need you here, then I don't know that your childcare limits are going to factor into that conversation from a legal matter. Now, from a moral matter, absolutely. And we all need to challenge our employers and employment context to be as moral and responsible as possible. We're working hard at the AG's office. So what I've told people is, if you are working at home and getting your work done, don't even think about the need to come back until Labor Day. We'll revisit it then and see what we're going to do. And we're committed to maintaining as much flexibility as we can. If other employers aren't willing to do that, you have a ethical challenge of how you negotiate that situation. Your legal rights are unlikely to be because of childcare. They might be if there's a public health risk to you or other issues that you can invoke.
Thank you. We have a couple follow-up questions in the chat about that, and then we need to wrap up. I really appreciated your time today. So the follow-up questions are, should there be some legislation around this? Is this something the governor could address? I just wanted to say that there are plenty of jobs that can't be done from home. We own a software consultancy. We've worked from home for years, so this isn't very different, except that it's a little harder to concentrate. As far as, our ability to do our job, that hasn't changed. But if you're a nurse, if you obviously work in a meat packing plant, if you work in a grocery store, you have to be there. So those folks, kids aren't in school. So, it's a tough situation. So whose job would it be to perhaps address this?
So as you put your finger on it, the real question is, how do we facilitate affordable childcare? What are the ways we do it? And the answer is, there are movements at all levels to address this. There are movements from the federal level to think about things like childcare credits so that people get money so they are able to pay for childcare. There are movements at the state level to address it. Some local governments have looked at this. This is an important issue. We have to think about equity and the ability of working parents, both working parents, and that means we have to think about childcare. And unfortunately, if you think about our safety net and our social safety net, we have not done enough, whether it's childcare, whether it's senior care, whether it's healthcare. We're seeing people being stretched. And so in this moment, part of what we have to do is ask, what are the points of stressing and failure in terms of our ability to just manage as human beings, and what we need as part of our societal path forward is to figure out what is the way forward to support everyone. And part of the challenge is some of these issues aren't easy to address. They're not ready solutions. So we've got to work hard and figure out what's to make the most sense. And the answer then is all levels have an ability to think about this using whatever tools they can to bring to bear.
Yeah. So Phil, I know that you're an incredibly busy guy. So we are incredibly honored that you were willing to take some time and spend with us. We know the importance of criminal justice reform. We are counting on both you and Tony Spurlock to implement appropriately the legislation that just passed and to be forward thinking about other ways that we can ensure that we have a just society that works for everybody and not just a few. This has been a very insightful and opportunistic opportunity for us to speak about not just criminal justice reform, but to ease in a few things about school safety. So I will leave it to Darien to close us out in terms of school safety and our appreciation for your comment on that as well.
Yes, I very much appreciate you talking about school safety, and Lisa's point, it's so important to talk about what is the data to back up what we're doing and to make our schools safe. When we're going to spend taxpayer dollars, we want to make sure that we have data to back up what we're spending that on. And so I'm really glad we were able to cover that today. And certainly as a parent, you know, sadly, one of the better things about this time of being in our houses is that I haven't been worried about my child being shot at school since March 12th. And that's a really sad statement on the state of the world, but that's the truth. So anyway, we're just so grateful to you, Phil, and all the hard work you're doing on behalf of our state and really on behalf of democracy. I love all the points you make about working across the aisle, finding solutions that work for everyone. Folks are tired of divisiveness. They appreciate your accessibility and your ability to listen. And we're really just so grateful to have you as our Attorney General and for your time tonight. Thank you so much.
Pleasure being with you guys. All of us who are here have an obligation to get the word out about this very important race. So thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks everybody.